Thank you, Mayhill. Good morning. First of all, I want to thank you for the opportunity to present some findings of my wider research project on gender aspects of the history of UNUPA, which is financially supported by Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies. Today I will analyze how the constructions of femininity, women's body, and nation and war in the nationalist discourse led to repressions against women's sexuality and its subordination to the goals and purpose of the Ukrainian underground movement. My aim is to uncover a victimized group which has largely been ignored in the traditional historical accounts. And first of all, I want to talk about who were enemy men. Because when we talk about punishment of women for horizontal collaboration, in particular in France, we know that most of enemy men were German occupiers, yes? But in Ukraine case, it's more complicated. Enemy men, first of all, were men who opposed the idea of the creation of independent Ukrainian state as imagined by the OUN. Another criteria, they criticize own ideology and methods of their activity, and then belonged to hostile minorities, Jews, Poles, Russians, worked for the Nazi and Soviet governments and Communist Party structures, and enemy men definitely were military men. I mean the men who were members of German armored forces, Red Army, Polish Armia Krajowa, Home Army, Soviet partisans, NKVD, MGB, and so on. And just a brief comment about the vision of female sexuality in the Ukraine underground movement. In the center of Ukraine nationalist discourse on female sexuality, there are notions of motherhood, loyalty, modesty, and virginity. According to nationalist view, the main task of women was to produce children and bring them up in an appropriate way. I mean, learning Ukrainian language, tradition, and adopting a patriotic worldview, and establish social norm and behavior. The necessity of sending sons to war was one of the key points of the nationalist discourse about women's duties. A legitimate and socially accepted way was to give birth to children after marriage. During the war, women's sexuality acquired additional connotation. Female body functioned as a symbolic representation of territory of the nation, of the motherland. The purity of women's body symbolized the purity and dignity of the nation and its male defenders. The protection of a woman's body from enemies, therefore, was equated with the protection of the integrity of the borders of the motherland. The only acceptable expression of female sexuality was when a woman made herself available only to true Ukrainian men. And here you see, on this slide, you see one of the propaganda materials of the UN, a leaflet, 10 important pieces of advice for Ukrainian girls. And you see that one point was, do not choose a foreigner as bridegroom, because you will never able to be happy with him. And another advice, marry only a nationally conscious, solid and honest Ukrainian, because you will be happy with him. Fraternization between local women and the enemy men was viewed as reprehensible. Such women were considered to have transgressed moral norms, social norms, and they were labeled as traitors of the whole nations. And here you see some examples of true Ukrainian couples. Ostap was the member of OUN, and Domna supported him in his struggle. And another couple, here you see all of these people are members of the OUN underground movement. And now I want to say a couple words about the punishment for romantic sexual relation with the enemy. As you see, the most popular form of punishment was stigmatization, ostracism, material damage, cutting and or shaving hair, beaten with sticks, so-called buki, exile from the village, and executions of women and their relatives. And now I want to give you some examples of this punishment. The available material suggests that immoral behavior referred not only to sexual relations, but flirting as well. And here you see the NKVD report about of the village in Volhynia region, where UPA shaved the head of three young girls because they have correspondence with the soldiers and officers of the Red Army. But not only girls, but also married women whose husbands were in the forest or on the front line could be punished for extramarital sexual relations with the enemy. In this slide, you see Hanna Zelena, 90 years old, ex-member of the UPA, and she told me about her village fellow, also Hanna, who was wife of insurgent UPA member, and she has four children. And when her husband was in the forest, she had sexual affairs with the Red Army officer in autumn 1944, and for this she was sentenced to the death. In this context, I want to give you another example, very remarkable for me, because many women were killed because of their sexual relation with the enemy, and especially when the girl was the member of the OUN. On June 1948, on the decision of the OUN leadership, a female insurgent Richka was executed because she, quote, compromised the OUN with absolutely immoral personal behavior, having immoral love relations even with the NKVD officer. This implies that love was not a mitigating circumstances, but rather the opposite. Sentimental feeling and empathy toward the enemy were considered to be a crime by the leadership of the underground. It was believed that such feeling would harm the struggle for of the nationalists for independent Ukraine. Cutting women's hair off was not just a method of punishment, but also a way to warn other community members. So it was practiced in a way that would achieve as much publicity as possible. For this, the OUN tried to choose days that were important for the local community. And for example, you see Solomia Venher, she also is a former member of OUN, and she told me a story of 6 young girl of her native village, Bohatkivtsi in Ternopilska Oblast, and all of them were punished by insurgent because they go out with Bolsheviks. And they were punished on the 5th May of 1946, on the eve of St. Uri's Day. And Solomia told me a little more about consequences for this young girl. The whole village was talking about it. It spread like wildfire. They come to know about it in another village. They didn't even go to church. They didn't go anywhere. Levitska, it was her friend, said she had a headache, and then cried and said she was not guilty of anything. We have many cases of punishment of women after the long stay of Red Army forces in the village. because they operated mainly in village and the forest near village, because very popular was a so-called military Chekist operation against insurgents, and they stayed in village a couple months. Thank you, thank you, Mayhew. And I want to stress that in some cases, responsibility for the immoral deeds of unmarried women was spread to their nearest relatives, in particular their parents, as they were expected to control their daughters. And here you see Lyudmila Slipa. She told about her village fellow, Malvina. She was executed because her daughter has sexual relations with MGB men. And I wanted to stress that we also talk about responsibility of wives for husbands. In most cases, SBON, Security Service of OUN, apply individual responsible for betrayal. But in many cases, parents of women were also punished. And here you see one of example of this. And also, in another slide, you see so-called ликвидативна листа, the list of those killed by the own security service, and it lists include the names of 3 women who were wives of the enemy men. And I want to stress that OUN's reporting documents normally indicated the reason of liquidation next to the names of those killed. But in many cases, near names of women, we have not evidence about their cooperation with the Soviet authorities. These women were only wives of enemy men. And I argue that punishment of women was not only directed at the women themselves, but also reserved as warning signal to the enemy men who were their lovers and husbands. For example, there were many examples when the members of OUN murdered Red Army soldiers' wives. It was meant to undermine their masculinity and encourage them to leave military service. And I jump to conclusions. Violence against women depended on different circumstances, and one of them was the level of women's engagement in the own activity, and also subjective decisions of the local leaders, and position of the OUN in given locality. And violence against women was used as a tool to preserve patriarchal power and traditional gender order in Ukrainian society, and to construct a power relation among nationalists, as well as their relation with the enemy men. Thank you very much.